You're about to go Inside PR on the FIR Podcast Network.
This is Inside PR 4.20 for Wednesday, August 19th. This week we say goodbye to Neville Hobson.
You're listening to Inside PR.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Inside PR, our weekly look at the world of public relations, social media, communications, marketing, digital marketing, and where everything meets and intersects. I'm Martin Waxman in Toronto.
I'm Jenny Dietrich in Chicago.
And I'm Joe Thornley in Ottawa.
And here we are in the middle, actually not the middle, near the end of the summer. Can you believe it?
Don't say that, Martin.
Everybody's going back to school. It's so weird.
Yeah. And in Toronto, you know, the end of the summer for me is the Canadian National Exhibition, the CNER, equivalent to a state fair, which is starting on Friday.
Well, there you go. It's the end of the summer.
Yeah.
For me, it's Labor Day, but so we have a couple more weeks.
Yeah. So here we are, and we have a slightly different show with a featured interview today. So Joe is going to talk about that in a few minutes, but why don't we start with Inside PR Must Know? And mine is from Business Insider, and it's all about how Facebook is competing more and more with Twitter and with Google and YouTube. But right now with Twitter creating an app that lets publishers send mobile breaking news alerts to the masses. So in a way, you know, the fight, as we've been talking about, seems to be how can these big social platforms get a handle on media, or what media used to cover, breaking news stories from around the world. And this is yet another example of how all the platforms are becoming more and more similar in many, many ways.
Everybody's trying to get pieces from each other, I guess, right?
Yep.
For sure. Good to know.
Yeah.
And speaking of pieces from one another, we're in election cycles in both the United States and Canada. And there was an interesting article that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences this month. Some research that was co-authored by Dr. Robert Epstein. And he and his co-author talked about the search engine manipulation effect, or SEAM. And what they found by conducting 5 double-blind, randomized, controlled experiments in the U.S. and India, this is a real scientific research, they found that indeed you could manipulate, or the search engine could manipulate the results that it showed on the first page of search for political issues and candidates, and based upon the different results that would be shown, they could affect the vote. Now, we all know as marketers that you want a position on the first page of search, and that first page can, in fact, shape how people approach your product or your service. We know that. And it's not a surprise that the same thing applies to politics. But I think that it's worth just remarking on as we head into the beginning of this election cycle, because this is our government and this is democracy we're talking about. It also probably underlines or allows people to understand why the Europeans, where Google has a much greater share of search engine, why the Europeans are so concerned about Google. Because basically, in relation to our search engine, we're in a we trust you mode. So far, Google has never done anything to betray that trust that I'm aware of when it comes to elections. But we should be aware of this, and it's a good civic duty to be vigilant about this kind of thing.
And then my IPR must know is I was having a little chat with Eden Spodek last week, who is launching a podcast called Ada's Sisters, I think in the next 2 weeks. Very exciting for Eden and her co-host. But she said, do you guys ever post podcasts to YouTube? And I said, no, I didn't realize you could do that. And actually, as a matter of fact, you can. There's a site called tunestotube.com, and it allows you to pull the audio. You upload an image, and then it will play your podcast as a video right on YouTube. So we're going to test it out, see how it works. see if it gets any new listeners and all that kind of fun stuff. But definitely something to be thinking about if you podcast.
That's a great tip, Ginny. Something worth looking at as we go into our next several years here. And when we talk about long-term podcasts, as you know, last week we talked about the fact that Neville Hobson has indicated he's putting down the mic and leaving the for immediate release Hobson and Holt's Report podcast after over 10 years with his partner, Shell Holtz. That for us is a big thing. And so we tracked down Neville over in England, and he was nice enough at 9 p.m. one night, his time, to do an interview. So we've got an interview with Neville Hobson where he talks about all things podcasting, how he got into it, the benefits of it. Have a listen, and we'll come back after Neville's interview. Neville Hobson. When I first discovered podcasting, I think I discovered it through you and Shell Holtz. In other words, when I first became aware of it, there you were. When did you start podcasting?
It would have been January 2005, Joe, when I started with Shell Holtz, the for immediate release, the Hobson and Holtz Report podcast. January 2005, although we did a test podcast in December 2004. So I guess that would have been the first time.
January 2005. Now, that's a long time ago. Who else was around at that time when you looked for inspiration at other podcasters? Who was doing it?
Oh, the names that come immediately to mind are people like Adam Curry, a true pioneer back in those early days. The video disc jockey, the American guy who lived in the Netherlands for many years. He was big over there. MTV, he was where he got his showbiz break, I suppose. But he started a show, the Daily Source Code, that captivated me, I have to admit. The other person, I suppose, who was the most business influence on me was Todd Cochran. Geek News Central, and he published the first book. Boy, was he quick at that, about podcasting back in 2000 and I think late 2004 even it could have been. So those were the two big influences on me, certainly. And there are lots of others who were around, most of which aren't there anymore. But those early pioneering days of homebrew radio, as I suppose many people called it. So, but Adam Curry, Todd Cochran, Eric Rice comes to mind, who was doing something around about that time. Those three names are the ones that resonate most with me.
These were the pioneers. You're out there with them. You're a communicator. At that point, I don't think you were in the UK. You were in Amsterdam?
That's right. I lived in the Netherlands at that time.
In the Netherlands. And so you're there. How did you get the idea for the Hobson and Holtz Report?
Well, let me go back one step before that, Joe, because it was really about how did I get the idea about podcasting? And that came to me through a post I read on a blog by a man called Rex Hammock, who is a publisher based in Nashville, Tennessee. And Rex was one of those folks that I discovered at the time when blogging was the big deal. There was only blogging, basically. And he wrote a post about something called podcasting that made me think, whoa, what is this? And I remember thinking, wow, this would be amazing for internal communication was the first thought in my mind, how you could use audio to communicate within organizations. And I just was thinking about the imaginative ways you could use audio. At the time, frankly, if I'd stopped to think about it more, no one was doing that at all. But that's when I first heard about podcasting. And coincidentally, Shell Holtz, my podcasting partner, and I've known Shell for many, many years, that predates the show we eventually started, was also thinking about this. And in fact, I got an email from Shell. It might have been a phone call. I think it was probably an email, where he had an idea for a podcast. I'd thought of one myself, to just do one myself. What Shell had in mind was more interesting than that. He thought about doing something with him in the US, he's in California, me in Europe, continental Europe as it happened, and we do a show that would be a perspective, if you will, from both sides of the Atlantic on emerging tech, things that caught our imaginations and attentions, and what was happening in these early days. And so we'd be the kind of shiny new objects testers that would talk about this stuff, what we saw happening, and so forth. So the idea for it came about that way.
And across 6, 7, 8, 9 time zones, that didn't deter you?
No, I mean, I was working, I just started out on my own as an independent consultant back in the latter part of 2004, after the company I've been working with was acquired. And I was looking for anything and everything that I could get my hands on to investigate, that I could talk to people about. And so time zones didn't matter. I would put in any amount of time that was necessary to do something like this. And Shell felt the same. And so, if we'd both been working for, if we both had regular jobs as employees for companies, probably none of this would have happened at all.
Well, and time, you put in a huge amount of time. I think for people who have discovered Hobson and Holt's in the more recent time, they think of it as a weekly podcast. But for many years, you were doing it twice a week, weren't you?
God, we were, Joe. My goodness me, we were doing Monday and Thursday twice a week. And it was at least an hour each time. So that was a lot of time. And in those very early days, we were also transcribing the show. We started doing that, realized quite quickly that was a non-starter unless we had someone to do it. It was very time-consuming. But we did show notes that had timestamps for each topic, which required listening to the recording to get the timing and so forth. So that was time-consuming. So we were doing that in those very early days as we got started. And indeed, I think most people were doing things like that in those pioneering days when all this stuff was just getting going. So it was fun, I have to admit. It was fun at those times.
Well, you've given so much, and I know since you've announced that you are leaving the show, I've seen Twitter traffic, I've talked to people, and they are a bit gobsmacked at the notion of having to deal with life without hearing your voice on a week-by-week basis. I know that you've given a huge amount to the community. When you look back on it, what have been the biggest benefits of podcasting for you as a communications practitioner? What would you say to people who might be contemplating it now that made it worthwhile?
Very good question, Joe. I would say there's no single thing. From a personal point of view, if I can start with that, I would say the one thing it gives you pretty much immediately is a sense of greater confidence in speaking about an idea where it may not be fully formed. It may even be something that you yourself think this might be a dumb idea, but I'm going to articulate it anyway. And you end up developing a greater, I would say, confidence in being able to share thoughts that aren't fully formed. And one of the great problems many people have is not doing that until they're kind of fully confident that the idea is thought through and they're not going to look stupid, basically. This does away with all of that. And it lets you, I suppose, take full advantage of that innate curiosity that you might have. And that, in my view, is a prerequisite. You've got to be the kind of person who is intensely curious about things, not just anything, but in the context of a business podcast like the ones Shell and I developed, business related. So I've always been like that myself. Shell has as well. So podcasting gave us a voice, no pun not intended, to talk about the things that we had a channel to express those things. That was not easier exactly, but more readily apparent to us than writing content, which requires a bit more thought. Here you could talk. It's immediate and it's spontaneous, even though you've got topics planned. It's perfect for exchanging thoughts and building on those sorts of conversation, which is what talk radio is all about. And of course, this stems greatly from that.
Well, I know when you'd say that, there are many of us who have followed in your footsteps. In the case of Ginny Martin and I, there are three of us. And one of the things as we were looking at it, and our predecessors, David Jones and Terry Follis, was the way that you and Shell would have a conversation and you would seem to learn from one another. You set a certain template of the conversation that actually led somewhere during the course of it. Didn't just lay out the facts, but you took us on a journey each and every conversation with you. Did you set out to do that, or did it just come naturally?
I think it came naturally, Joe. I mean, that's one of the great things about the Hobson and Holtz report that I've certainly enjoyed, and I'm certain Shell has as well. As you've actually articulated that very well indeed, because I learn new things every time we do the show. A lot of it from Shell, a lot of it that results from the discourse that we have, the exchange of commentary about something that gives each of us a perspective that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of if we'd been doing this just by ourselves. And so that is hugely beneficial. And that has actually been one of the big drivers of interest to me. Every single episode we do when we get together is looking forward to that, what am I going to learn this time that I didn't know, or what angle am I going to be exposed to that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't been having this conversation. And that also extends out not just to Shell and I talking, but over time as it develops, input from listeners in the comments that we include in each show, those comments that are written in the online places that have evolved to what we now have, the podcast community on Google+, the reports from people like Dan York, who's been a stalwart, a columnist, I suppose, an audio columnist, as I think of Dan, since those very early days, and Michael Netzley in Singapore. And we learn from what those guys are saying. Michael, in fact, gives us perspectives on a part of the world and things going on related to digital communication that we'd probably never really think about. We might read something, but Michael gives his perspective on things going on in Asia, notably in China and other big countries out there. So you learn every time, and I hear that from listeners, frankly. But as the co-host, I can say equally too, I learn every single episode that we did.
Yeah, well, when you talk about the correspondence, I think back to when Lee Hopkins was the correspondent from the hills of Melbourne.
No, I think it was Adelaide.
Brisbane, Adelaide, the hills of Adelaide in Australia. And there would be, the podcast in those early days was unique in that there was Shell anchoring and two very distinct accents on either side of him, spanning the globe. And you kept that up with Michael Netzley, and you have Dan York, and you've had other correspondents over time. How did you go about getting the correspondence? Where did they come from?
They came from, in the case of Lee and Dan in particular, I recall, they came from those guys were listeners who submitted comments. And submitted comments so frequently that we said, in the case of Lee, I remember it well, Shell saying on the show, if he sends in another comment, we're going to make him a correspondent. And he did. And so he became then a regular feature. And Dan evolved in a similar manner too. Michael Netzley came to us via Joseph Jaffe, actually. He was a contributor to Joe's podcast at the time, and we kind of grabbed him from Joe and brought him into FIR. We had David Phillips in the UK who had a great perspective where he lives, as he put it, in the shadow of Stonehenge. I mean, it conjures up an image, does it not? And so he provided a very uniquely English perspective to what we were saying. So it's been terrific having correspondence. And of course, we've had some semi-regular correspondents who file who present commentaries regularly. People like Bernie Goldbach in Ireland, for instance, and many others. And so it's a vibrant participatory experience, I think, with, I suppose you could say that Shell and I have been the anchors for it, and it also embraces lots of other voices too.
Well, it truly has been something unique, and I think it's too easy after 10 years for people to take it for granted because we've become so familiar with it and reliant on it. But you and Shell invented this. You made it up the first time. And you have been a true trailblazer, and we're going to miss you. At least your voice frequently. So you'll still be on social media, won't you?
Oh, very much so, Joe. I mean, to me, this is an opportunity for a renaissance. I mean, what I decided was to call it a day with the Hobson and Holt report, which to make it quite clear, it's just this show that's ending. The Hobson and Holt report is one show in a burgeoning network, the FIR podcast network, that has evolved out over the past 18 months or so. There are now 22 individual podcasts in this network, presented by a wide range of people, including three particular folks, yourself, Martin, and Jeannie, who brought your show, Inside PR, to the network. So it's just the Hobson Holt report, which was the start of all of this, that after 10 years, I felt it was time to draw the curtains on it from my point of view. I guess I felt it had reached the end of the line for it, let's put it that way. And so Shell is got certainly big plans to develop a replacement show, big plans for the network, and news about all of that is already trickling out. But I see going forward, very much I'm on social media, and indeed I'm taking this as an opportunity to get back into blogging, which I've neglected sorely in recent years. It's been literally a couple of years where my blog is literally just the show notes for the Hobson and Holt report, which I want to spend far more time on that. So yeah, I'll be very much on social media. I'll always support FIR, so expect to see retweets and so forth about shows and stuff like that. But it's great to be able to think about the things that I enjoy doing just for the sake of it, writing narratives that don't really have anything to do with monetization or how many shares it gets and stuff like that. And I'm going to develop and devote a great deal more time to that as I'm able to, in the context of everything else going on, meaning the paid work that you've got to do. But I feel that this is a good moment to take these steps, to end one thing and restart another. That's how I'm looking at it.
Well, Neville, in a medium in which people pod fade very often after 2, 3, or 4 episodes, after 10 years, nobody will ever accuse you of having a short attention span. And you have given a huge amount to all of us. I know Ginny, Martin, and I, when we are talking about things that we want to talk about on our show, we've all listened to you and Neville. You have provided, you and Shell, you have provided inspiration to us over time. And thank you for being one of the pioneers. Thank you for the time you put into it, for the things that you taught us, for the things that you did for the first time. And by all means, I'm going to look for where you pop up in your next act.
Well, Joe, I appreciate that. That's very kind of you to say that, and I thank you so much for that. And I'm certainly going to be around. I will listen to shows. I listen to Inside PR. I might even actually have time to comment on your show. Finally, Joe, that'd be a good time. So I will be very much part of the social landscape as we go forward.
Well, that's great, Neville Hobson. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
So that's Neville Hobson. Martin, Ginny, what stood out?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I loved. One, he's got great stories, and man, he and Shell Holtz have seen it all, because they've really, they were there at the beginning of communications and business podcasting. But when he called podcasting homebrew radio, I love that expression. And I thought, wow, that's really is what it is. We get to sit in our offices, our homes, wherever we are, and create these shows, if we have an opinion, and share that opinion and hopefully keep our listeners engaged. So I like that. I am now going to try some other homebrew things, but I won't tell you what those are.
Oh, come on.
No, I don't know. I'm not really a DIY guy. Yeah, coffee I will try.
Yeah, I'm sad, I think I mentioned this last week, to be losing Neville's accent, which, as we were joking in the FIR Podcast Network Slack group, it's an accent to all of us and probably not to anybody over there. But I will miss that, and I also will miss the insight that they have, especially together. And you guys both know serving as a guest host with them is pretty intense and pretty scary because they're so well organized, and I'm going to miss some of that as well. I'm sure Shell will take some of that on to his future engagement, but They were a class act together. I'll miss them for sure.
Yep.
You are absolutely right. And if you're listening to this before the end of August, there's still a few more shows to go with Neville and Shell together. So flip over to the Hobson and Holtz Report podcast and listen to them. You're hearing a long act in its final phase.
Yeah, and there's still lots to learn. That's another thing that Neville said is in order to be a podcaster, you need to be curious, and it helps you explore ideas. And I think we all find that. So we would love to hear what you think, and we'd love to hear your reminiscences of the earlier days of FIR and the Hobson-Holtz Report, and even Inside PR. We'll take those too. You can send us a note to insideprcomments@gmail.com. Leave us a comment on our blog, insidepr.ca. Find us on Twitter at inside_PR, at Jenny Dietrich, at Thornley, at Martin Waxman, the Inside PR podcast group on Facebook, the Inside PR community on Google+, as part of the FIR Podcast Network. And a reminder for next week, because I think that's coming up, please join us for the first Inside PR Book Club, where we, along with you, will be reading and commenting on Donna Papacosta and Steve Lubetkin's The Business of Podcasting. So if you haven't picked up the book, check it out on Amazon. Leave us a comment. And until next week, it's Martin in Toronto.
Jenny in Chicago.
And Joe in Ottawa.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye.
Bye all.